Think the Wild West was all about six-shooters and quick-draw duels? Think again. Behind every saloon door and stagecoach seat lurked a weapon even more feared than the revolver: the shotgun. From sawed-off scatterguns blasting through bank robberies to heavy coach guns guarding gold shipments, these weren't hunting toys. They were brutal, bone-shattering weapons that earned nicknames like Street Howitzer for a reason. Today, we're revealing the 15 deadliest shotguns of the American frontier, the real scatterguns that outlaw gangs, sheriffs, and stagecoach guards used to survive in the dust and blood of the Old West. Some of these are iconic, some nearly forgotten, but every one of them rewrote the rules of survival. Let's start at the bottom of the list, with a shotgun you probably didn't even realize was everywhere on the frontier. Number 15, Belgian trade shotguns, the frontier's disposable weapon. Not every settler could afford a fine Parker or a factory-made Colt. For thousands of pioneers heading west, their shotgun came stamped with a single word: Liège. In the mid-1800s, Belgium's Liège district churned out cheap, mass-produced double barrels by the tens of thousands. They were shipped in crates across the Atlantic and sold through hardware stores and catalogs in frontier towns from Dodge City to Tombstone. Prices were so low that a homesteader could pick one up for just a few dollars, making them the first firearm many families ever owned. These trade shotguns weren't refined, and they weren't always safe. Made with lower-grade steel, their barrels sometimes warped or even burst under heavy black powder loads. But for the average cowboy, farmer, or immigrant who simply needed something to hunt birds, guard the cabin, or face down trouble on the trail, they were good enough. Outlaws sometimes sawed them short, turning a budget hunting gun into a brutal street weapon. Stage drivers tucked them under seats when nothing else was available. And in countless frontier photographs, the battered shotgun leaning against a cabin wall was almost certainly Belgian-made. They were the disposable scatterguns of the Wild West, unreliable, even dangerous, yet everywhere. For better or worse, Belgian trade shotguns armed more ordinary frontiersmen than almost any other weapon on this list. Number 14. Parker Brothers shotguns, the gentleman's double. If Belgian trade guns were the poor man's scattergun, Parker Brothers shotguns were the opposite, the finest doubles American money could buy. Built in Meriden, Connecticut, Parkers were beautifully crafted side-by-sides that became a mark of wealth and status across the frontier. But make no mistake, these weren't just elegant hunting pieces. Parker barrels were famous for their tight shot patterns, meaning more pellets on target and far greater lethality at close and medium range. A Parker in skilled hands could reliably drop game at distances where cheaper doubles scattered wide and lost killing power. In a gunfight, that precision meant the difference between a missed chance and a decisive kill. Wealthy ranch owners, lawmen with deep pockets, and prominent frontiersmen often carried Parkers not just for show, but because they were as deadly as they were beautiful. Chambered in 10 and 12 gauge, they fired the same bone-crushing shells as any coach gun, only with the consistency and accuracy that came from world-class craftsmanship. Even Theodore Roosevelt favored Parkers on his legendary hunts, a reputation that spilled westward. When a lawman walked into a saloon with a Parker tucked under his arm, it wasn't just a statement of style. It was a warning that he had the very best tool for the job. The only drawback was cost. A Parker could cost several times more than a Belgian import, putting it out of reach for most cowboys. But for those who could afford one, the Parker Brothers shotgun was more than a symbol of refinement. It was the gentleman's answer to violence on the frontier. Number 13. W.W. Greener shotguns, the British invader. Across the Atlantic, Birmingham gunsmith W.W. Greener was building some of the most respected shotguns in the world. And though they were made in England, plenty of them found their way to the American frontier, carried by stagecoach guards, ranchers, and settlers who wanted something tougher than the cheap Belgian imports. Greener doubles were known for innovative features, especially their patented crossbolt locking system. This design kept the barrels locked tight, even after firing heavy black powder loads, a problem that plagued lesser-made guns. On the dusty frontier, where repairs were scarce and reliability meant survival, that toughness made a Greener worth its weight in gold. Some Wells Fargo agents were even issued imported Greener shotguns, making them part of the same legend that gave us the phrase riding shotgun. That connection gave the British scattergun a foothold in Wild West history, even if it was never as widespread as Colt or Remington doubles. Carrying one also sent a message. Imported guns were rare and expensive, so anyone with a greener was assumed to have both means and skill. Outlaws often backed down at the sight of those twin barrels, knowing a greener wasn't a throwaway gun. It was a precision-built tool of destruction. They were never the most common shotguns on the frontier, but their reputation traveled far. With superior engineering and the weight of Wells Fargo behind them, W.W. Greener shotguns proved that the Wild West didn't just rely on American steel. Sometimes the deadliest firepower came stamped, made in Britain. Number 12. Ithaca hammer shotguns, the frontier's workhorse. Founded in 1880, the Ithaca Gun Company quickly built a reputation for producing rugged, affordable, hammer-fired doubles that became staples of frontier life. They weren't ornate, they weren't status symbols, but they were reliable, and that made them invaluable. Frontiersmen loved Ithacas because they could do it all. A single shotgun might put food on the table in the morning, guard the homestead at night, and ride in a saddle scabbard during the day. For settlers with little money and no room for luxury, an Ithaca hammer double was the Swiss Army knife of the frontier. Chambered in 10 and 12 gauge, these shotguns packed devastating power. At close range, a blast of buckshot could drop a charging outlaw or predator instantly. At longer ranges, they patterned well enough for hunting deer, birds, or even buffalo in a pinch. They were simple, rugged tools that could be counted on to fire when it mattered most. Lawmen also trusted them. Small-town sheriffs who couldn't afford a Parker or didn't need a Wells Fargo coach gun often had an Ithaca leaning behind their desk. Their straightforward design made them easy to maintain, even after years of exposure to dust, rain, and rough handling. Unlike Parkers or Greeners, Ithacas weren't trophies. They were working guns for working people, tools that earned their keep day after day on the frontier. In a land where survival depended on reliability, the Ithaca hammer shotgun was a quiet but deadly companion that never let its owner down. Number 11. Whitney Shotguns, the forgotten frontier maker. The Whitney name is usually tied to rifles, but the New Haven Company also produced double-barrel shotguns that quietly armed the frontier. They weren't as polished as Parkers and they weren't as widespread as Ithacas, but in the right hands, a Whitney could still be the difference between life and death. Whitney shotguns often showed up as stopgap weapons. A farmer might pick one up because it was all the local hardware store carried. A ranch hand might inherit one secondhand. They weren't always the first choice, but when danger came knocking, a Whitney was better than nothing. And at close range, even a plain, unremarkable double barrel became a fight stopper. Typically chambered in 10 or 12 gauge, Whitney doubles fired the same heavy loads as their more famous competitors. What set them apart wasn't innovation, but availability. In an era when supply wagons and catalog orders could take weeks or months to arrive, a Whitney on the shelf was often the only shotgun a man could get his hands on. That gave them a quiet but important role in frontier survival. They didn't earn nicknames like Street Howitzer or carry the prestige of a Wells Fargo coach gun, but they still leaned behind doors, sat under saddles, and rode west with settlers who had no other option. Whitney shotguns were never legendary. They were the forgotten defenders of the West, plain, practical, and often overlooked, yet still capable of unleashing the same deadly thunder that made shotguns the most feared weapons of the frontier. Number 10. Remington Model 1889, the Hammer Double. By the late 1880s, the shotgun had become the weapon of choice for stagecoach guards, lawmen, and townsfolk who needed raw stopping power. And one of the most trusted names in that space was Remington. Their Model 1889 was a rugged side-by-side with exposed hammers, chambered in both 10 and 12 gauge. This was a working gun through and through. It wasn't built to impress with engravings or gold inlays. It was built to fire every time a man pulled the trigger, no matter how much dust, rain, or rough riding it endured. For stagecoach companies, sheriffs, and even ranchers, the 1889 was a weapon you could count on when everything was on the line. The twin hammers made it easy to check at a glance if the gun was cocked, an advantage lawmen valued in tense situations. And when those hammers dropped, the heavy black powder loads it fired could tear through doors, scatter mobs, or stop an outlaw dead in his tracks. The 1889 also marked a turning point in Remington's history. It was the last exposed hammer double-barrel shotgun the company produced, closing out an era of frontier scatterguns before newer hammerless and repeating designs took over. In that sense, it stood at the crossroads between the old world of simple doubles and the dawning age of modern shotguns. Heavy, brutal, and utterly dependable, the Remington 1889 earned its place as one of the frontier's most trusted fighting shotguns, a weapon that closed out a bloody chapter of Old West firepower. Number 9. Colt Model 1878, the stagecoach favorite.
Colt may be best remembered for its revolvers, but in 1878, the company turned its engineering toward the shotgun and delivered one of the most respected doubles of the frontier. The Colt Model 1878 was a powerful side-by-side chambered in 10 and 12 gauge, designed to compete with Remington and Parker in the booming scattergun market. What set the 1878 apart was its reputation for Colt-quality toughness. This wasn't a bargain bin import. It was a factory-made powerhouse from America's most famous gunmaker. Stagecoach guards prized it for its reliability. Bartenders tucked them under counters, knowing one blast could clear an entire brawl. And lawmen favored them for posse duty, where a dependable shotgun could mean survival against armed gangs. The 1878 quickly earned the nickname coach gun when stage lines began cutting down barrels for easier use in tight spaces. Shortened or full length, it packed the same devastating punch, a cloud of buckshot that could shred an ambush or stop a desperate outlaw dead in his tracks. Unlike the Wells Fargo guns that became cultural symbols, the Colt 1878 was first and foremost a working weapon. It represented the peak of Colt's scattergun craftsmanship, heavy, rugged, and brutally effective. For anyone sitting atop a stagecoach or keeping order in a saloon, there was no mistaking the Colt 1878. It wasn't just another shotgun, it was a Colt. And on the frontier, that name alone carried enough weight to make men think twice. Number 8. Wells Fargo coach guns, guardians of the gold. Few weapons are as tied to the image of the Wild West as the short, brutal coach gun carried by Wells Fargo messengers. These weren't just shotguns, they were the very symbol of security on the frontier's dangerous roads. Most were cut-down doubles, often Colt 1878s, Remingtons, or Ithacas, shortened to around 20 inches for quick handling. Chambered in 10 or 12 gauge, they fired devastating loads of buckshot that could tear through an ambush in a single blast. Guards nicknamed them Street Howitzers, and for good reason. At close range, their firepower was nothing short of terrifying. But what made the Wells Fargo coach gun legendary wasn't just its stopping power. It was the mythos it created. The armed guard seated beside the driver, coach gun across his lap, became such a familiar sight that the phrase riding shotgun was born, a piece of frontier slang we still use today. Outlaws dreaded that image. Passengers found comfort in it, and stage lines built their reputations on it. Where the Colt 1878 was a respected factory-made shotgun, the Wells Fargo coach gun became something larger, a cultural icon of law and order. Its presence meant gold shipments could move across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Its reputation alone was sometimes enough to stop a robbery before it started. Heavy, ugly, and devastating, the Wells Fargo coach gun wasn't just another firearm. It was the weapon that defined stagecoach security, the shotgun that turned dangerous trails into lifelines of the American frontier. Number 7. Winchester Model 1887, the lever-action shockwave.
By the 1880s, Winchester rifles had already earned their place as the gun that won the West. But Winchester wasn't content to rule the rifle market. They wanted to do the same with shotguns. And in 1887, they unveiled one of the most revolutionary scatterguns ever built, the Winchester Model 1887.
Designed by none other than John Moses Browning, the 1887 was one of the first successful repeating shotguns in history. Instead of breaking open for just 2 shots, it used a lever-action mechanism that allowed shooters to fire up to 5 rounds of 12-gauge shells in rapid succession. In a world still dominated by slow, 2-shot doubles, the sight of a man working the lever and firing again and again was nothing short of jaw-dropping. For lawmen and stage guards who got their hands on one, the 1887 was a force multiplier. An outlaw used to facing 2 barrels suddenly found himself staring at a weapon that could unleash a storm of lead before he even cleared leather. The psychological impact was immense. Stories spread quickly of desperados dropping their weapons at the sight of a repeating shotgun. Of course, it wasn't perfect. The 1887 was heavy, slower to reload once empty, and expensive compared to simpler doubles. But none of that mattered to those who wielded it. The Model 1887 proved that the shotgun was no longer just a blunt instrument of frontier justice. It was evolving into something new, a repeating shockwave of destruction that pushed firepower into the modern age. Number 6. Sawed-off shotguns, the outlaw's equalizer. If the Wells Fargo coach gun symbolized law and order, its darker twin was the sawed-off shotgun, the weapon of choice for bank robbers, train bandits, and desperados across the West. By hacking the barrels down to a foot or less, outlaws created a weapon that could be hidden under a coat and unleashed in the tightest of spaces. At point-blank range, it was devastating. A blast of buckshot that could tear through a crowd, scatter a posse, or make a room full of armed men freeze in terror. Bank robbers used them to control panicked customers. Train bandits smuggled them aboard under their jackets. Gamblers carried them into saloons, ready to flip the odds in a heartbeat. One Wells Fargo agent even admitted that the sight of a sawed-off shotgun was often enough to break civilian morale. Because unlike a revolver, it could wound or kill multiple people with a single blast. But for all their power, sawed-offs came with brutal drawbacks. Recoil was punishing, accuracy was almost non-existent, and anyone trying to use one beyond a few yards was as likely to miss as to hit. Outlaws didn't care. In close quarters, where fear was as valuable as firepower, a sawed-off was the ultimate equalizer. A weapon that made even a desperate man a deadly threat. To the frontier towns of the Wild West, few sights were more dreaded than a coat swinging open to reveal the stubby barrels of a sawed-off shotgun. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a declaration that chaos had arrived.
Number 5. Spencer shotgun, the rare legacy. Most people know the Spencer as the rifle that helped win the Civil War, but few realize the company also produced a 12-gauge repeating shotgun. Rare though it was, this weapon carried the Spencer name, and the firepower that came with it, into the American West. Using the same tubular magazine system as its rifle cousin, the Spencer shotgun could hold multiple shells and fire them in rapid succession. At a time when most men relied on just 2 shots before reloading, the Spencer gave its owner a shocking advantage, the ability to keep shooting without pause. Many of these shotguns were carried west by Civil War veterans who already trusted the Spencer design with their lives. For them, it was familiar, reliable, and a step ahead of what most frontiersmen had ever seen. Settlers used them to defend homesteads. Lawmen prized them for facing armed gangs, and hunters valued the ability to drop multiple birds or small game in seconds. Production numbers were low, and the Spencer shotgun never spread as widely as the Winchester 1887 or standard doubles. But its importance lay in what it represented, a bridge between the battlefields of the Civil War and the lawless frontier. It showed that repeating technology wasn't just for rifles anymore. It was changing shotguns too. Though scarce, the Spencer shotgun was a glimpse of the future, proving that the scattergun was evolving beyond 2 barrels at a time. In the hands of the few who carried it, it was a rare but formidable edge in the unforgiving West. Number 4. Whitney-Kennedy Lever-Action shotgun, the forgotten experiment.
In the 1870s, the Whitney Arms Company tried something few gunsmiths dared. They built one of the first lever-action shotguns. Known today as the Whitney-Kennedy, this rare scattergun attempted to bring the rapid-fire mechanics of the lever-action rifle into the world of shotguns. Like the Winchester 1887 that would follow, the Whitney-Kennedy used a tubular magazine to feed multiple shells in succession. On paper, it was decades ahead of its time. A man with a Whitney-Kennedy could pour out shot after shot, while others fumbled to reload their doubles. In theory, it gave a lone frontiersman the firepower of an entire posse. But in practice, the shotgun was scarce. Ammunition was expensive, the mechanism complex, and Whitney lacked Winchester's vast marketing reach. Only a handful of these guns ever made it into the hands of settlers or lawmen. For those lucky enough to own one, it was nothing short of revolutionary. But for most frontiersmen, it remained something they'd only hear about in rumors. That scarcity is what makes the Whitney-Kennedy shotgun so fascinating today. It was a frontier experiment, a bold step toward the repeating shotguns that would eventually dominate the 20th century, but one that never quite caught on in its own time. Rare, unusual, and far ahead of its peers, the Whitney-Kennedy lever shotgun stands as proof that the Wild West was as much a testing ground for innovation as it was a land of tradition. Number 3, the 10-gauge Street Howitzer, the scattergun of terror. Few weapons of the Wild West carried a reputation as fearsome as the 10-gauge, quote, Street Howitzer. These were short-barreled doubles, usually chambered in brutal 10-gauge shells, and at close range, they were nothing less than devastating.
A blast from one of these could shred a saloon door, cut down multiple attackers, or even stop a charging horse in its tracks. The muzzle flash lit up darkened streets, the recoil rattled the shooter's bones, and the sheer roar of a 10-gauge indoors could leave men stunned, deafened, and terrified. Lawmen sometimes used them for crowd control, knowing that one shot could scatter a mob faster than any revolver. Outlaws feared them for the same reason. A man armed with a revolver could threaten another man, but a street howitzer threatened everyone in the room. The psychological impact was immense. Facing down its gaping barrels often made gunfights end before they began. Stagecoach guards, jailhouse deputies, and even saloon owners relied on them. Outlaws, meanwhile, sometimes sawed them down even further, creating compact, concealable weapons that were as much instruments of terror as they were firearms. The street howitzer wasn't precise, it wasn't elegant, and it wasn't subtle. But in the brutal calculus of the Wild West, it was the ultimate fight stopper. A scattergun so feared that its very nickname became a warning. Number 2, Remington Model 1873, the first pump action.
Decades before pump-action shotguns became standard, Remington stunned the firearms world with a Model 1873, one of the very first of its kind. At a glance, it looked strange compared to the side-by-sides everyone knew. But its sliding forearm allowed a shooter to cycle shells with a single pump, ejecting a spent casing and chambering a fresh round almost instantly. For frontiersmen accustomed to breaking open their doubles after every 2 shots, the 1873 was nothing short of astonishing. A man could keep firing as fast as he could work the action, laying down repeatable firepower that most outlaws had never even imagined. Witnesses described the sight of a pump shotgun spitting shells as surreal, almost unbelievable, as if the frontier had suddenly leapt into the future. Chambered in 20 and 12 gauge, the 1873 was powerful, reliable, and decades ahead of its time. But its innovation came at a price. Ammunition was costly, production numbers were limited, and many settlers simply didn't understand or trust the new design. As a result, it never spread widely across the West. Yet, its impact can't be overstated. The Remington 1873 showed that the shotgun was no longer bound by just 2 barrels. It was the birth of modern firepower, a direct ancestor of the pumps that would dominate law enforcement, warfare, and home defense for the next century. Rare though it was on the frontier, those who carried it wielded a weapon so advanced it seemed almost unfair, a glimpse of a deadlier future in the heart of the Wild West. Number 1, Colt and Wells Fargo coach guns, the shotguns that defined the frontier. If one shotgun can be called the deadliest of the Wild West, it's the short, heavy, double barrel we now know simply as the coach gun. Chambered in 10 or 12 gauge and built by companies like Colt, Remington, and Ithaca, these scatterguns weren't just weapons of stage line guards. They became the frontier's all-purpose fight stopper. A Wells Fargo messenger might have carried one to protect gold shipments, but just as often, a bartender kept one hidden under the counter, a sheriff leaned one behind the jailhouse door, or a rancher propped one by the cabin wall. The coach gun's appeal was simple. It was short, rugged, and devastating at close range. A blast of buckshot could end a robbery, scatter a mob, or stop a predator cold. What set it apart was how universal it became. Fancy Parkers might have hung on the walls of the wealthy, and rare innovations like the Winchester 1887 turned heads, but the coach gun was everywhere. Rich or poor, outlaw or lawman, townsman or settler, the double-barrel coach gun was the one weapon almost everyone trusted when lives were on the line. It was more than a firearm. It was the great equalizer of the West, a shotgun so reliable, so feared, and so widely carried that it came to represent the very spirit of frontier survival. More than any other scattergun, the coach gun wasn't just part of the Wild West. It was the Wild West. From cheap Belgian imports to elegant Parkers, from outlaw sawed-offs to revolutionary pumps, these shotguns weren't just tools of survival. They were the weapons that shaped the American frontier. Unlike the revolvers Hollywood made famous, the shotgun story was one of raw power and intimidation. They weren't carried for duels, they were carried to end fights in an instant, whether by a sheriff in a jailhouse, a guard on a stagecoach, or a rancher defending his homestead. And at the top of them all stood the coach gun, the double-barrel scattergun that became the great equalizer of the West, trusted by lawmen and feared by outlaws across the frontier. So now, we want to hear from you.
Which of these deadly shotguns shocked you the most? Were you surprised to see rare experiments like the Winchester 1887 or Remington's first pump action? Or do you think nothing could ever top the raw fear of a sawed-off scattergun? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing which frontier weapons fascinate you most. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real firepower of the Wild West, hit that like button. It really helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe for more myth-busting looks at the guns, legends, and untold truths of America's most dangerous era.